All right. Hello, everyone. I am here with Keith Woods, the author of Nationalism, The Politics of Identity. Great read. And after long ado, we're finally back for episode 5 of Understanding Platonism. Today, Keith has prepared a discussion on this spermatikos logos, the so-called reason principles of nature. So I'll let you go ahead and just take that away, Keith.
Yeah, when we do the next episode, I promise it'll be worth the wait with all of the research we've been doing in the background. I think we
Right.
probably are the most successful Platonist podcast ever, though. If you
Easily.
search
Yeah.
Platonist podcast, we will be like top results.
So what has been going on? I've seen a lot of activity. You've been traveling around Europe. So what have you been up to in
hmm
the last few months?
Yeah, there's been some interesting stuff going on in Europe. A couple of months ago, I was at the Remigration Summit in Milan. A lot of big names there. Martin Sellner and Afonso Goncalves from Portugal are the guys that were organizing that. Dries van Langenhove as well. And there were some bigger names. There were people from the Vox party in Spain, from Chega in Portugal. AFD had a representative there. Eva Vlardingerbroek gave a speech. And it got a lot of attention. It made national news in Italy because of all of the controversies with, of course, Antifa trying to cancel the conference and so on. So that was very interesting, very white pilling experience, meeting the people there. Very impressive bunch of guys. More recently, there was another big protest in Ireland over mass immigration. That's something that's been growing the last couple of years here. Is the this kind of people's movement of these organized protests against immigration. And I was there with the National Party, probably like 10 to 20,000 people on the streets of Dublin. Looked very good kind of propaganda for our side. Most recently, I was in Poland and Germany. Originally, I went over there to cover the situation that's happening on the German-Polish border. Uh, some Polish nationals kind of alerted me to this and asked me to cover it, where Germany is sending asylum seekers back over the border. And this is leading to Poland reinstating border checks, which is kind of undermining the Schengen system. But I actually filmed a full documentary there on that situation, but more generally, the rise of nationalism in Poland and Germany and the immigration situation there. And worked out pretty well. I didn't have much of a plan going over, but just contacted people that know people, and ended up getting quite good access. Actually, I talked to Lena Kotre, who's AFD's official remigration spokesperson, um, and that made like national news in Germany. That was headlines that she talked to this terrible far right person. It was covered in Die Welt, which is a big mainstream newspaper there. They were using it to try and push for the banning of the AFD. And then in Poland, it was very interesting as well. I talked to a lot of the senior Confederacja members. One of them was Krzysztof Malava, who's their immigration spokesman. He invited us into a meeting in the Polish parliament on the effects of immigration. That was very cool to take part in. And yeah, they're a really good bunch of guys, really impressive. May potentially be the next government of Poland, actually, the way things are going. They're growing a lot in support. Their presidential candidate did really well in the presidential election recently. And they could well be the lead party in a coalition in the next government. So that's very exciting. That those guys that were talking to me, giving me interviews for this documentary, could be ministers in the next Polish government. So yeah, I'm hoping to go more in that direction. Actually, I think that's one thing we're kind of lacking is like quality documentaries and films. I look at like the kind of leverage you have making that kind of thing. Like I look back, there has been a lot of documentaries made by our side, very little. But if you look at the effect of them, they've been quite large. Like I think back to Lawrence Southern's Farmlands documentary, which I don't know what year that was. Maybe it was 2017, 18. But that was pretty big news at the time. I even remember that mentioned in kind of mainstream media here. And from that, I think, it was a big part of the discussion of white genocide in South Africa entering into discussion in conservative circles. And now, of course, Trump and the White House are discussing it. But even someone like Tommy Robinson, who has been heavily censored off platforms the last few years, he's had quite a big impact with his documentary films. So I think we could reach a big audience putting out more polished quality stuff like that. I went out with a professional videographer. We had the full kit. It's looking very good, what I've seen so far. So I'm excited for that, and already have a couple of future projects in mind on that regard. And yeah, I'm also working on a couple of books. One will be of interest to you. I'm writing one about decentralization, um, localism. It's kind of a theory of history of why we have very centralized periods in history, why we have very decentralized periods in history, what drives that, and why I think we're heading for another very decentralized period of dispersed sovereignty. And also brings in a lot of social science of why smaller communities, homogeneous communities, are better, superior to mass society, how they solve a lot of the problems mass society is creating, birth rate problems, alienation, and so on. So I'm excited for that. I think it'll be a good way to kind of introduce the nationalist perspective from a new angle, maybe to a new audience. And it's something that's becoming very relevant. Projects like yourself, I've seen other YouTube channels now that are talking about intentional communities. Obviously, people have a sense that we're living through a period where things are kind of falling apart in terms of making something like American democracy work, and how splintered people are, and people are looking for other exit strategies and avenues. So that's a book I'm hoping to release in the next couple of months, and also releasing a book about Napoleon. It's actually, I got quite into Napoleonic history this year, but when I get into history, I like reading like primary sources, and I was trying to read stuff directly from Napoleon. I found this really interesting memoir by his Irish doctor when he was exiled to St. Helena, and it's like 1,200 pages. Most of it is like boring medical notes, and Napoleon had a poached egg for breakfast this morning. But there's some really interesting stuff in there where he's just kind of candidly reflecting on his life, and a lot of it is him kind of defending himself for posterity. So it's kind of an abridged version of that. That's just Napoleon's reflection. So I'm hoping to get that out pretty soon as well. So yeah, you've been making big news. I just watched your Sky News piece the other day. I was very impressed.
Yeah, I think they did a good job. I mean, obviously it was intended to be a hit piece, but I think most of the people in the YouTube comment section liked what we were doing. Especially appreciate all of like the black people and Muslims and Asians who are seeing this and saying like, I don't see the problem, you know? I think a
Mm.
coalition in the US of intentional communities of different ethnic groups would be a great addition to the current kind of dialectic that's going on, spurred on by RTTL in the news. But yeah, I want to get back and ask more about, what you've been up to lately. When is this documentary likely to come out?
Now, hoping to get out within the next couple of weeks. So normally for a project like that, it would take a lot longer, but my videographer is like working around the clock editing it to try and get it out soon, because the issue with the Polish-German border is quite topical. It might not be in the news in a month's time, so we wanted to get it out as soon as possible. So hoping for the next couple of weeks.
Great. And it'll be released on what platform?
Um, I think, I mean, I will probably release it on X. I mean, this is the issue kind of, if you have a documentary, is, well, if you want to hire professional videographers and do, a really quality job that doesn't just like you're filming on a GoPro or something, it actually costs money. I'm hiring like a videographer who does this full time. So I had been thinking about strategies for that, in terms of, I don't want to paywall it. Um, but hopes that people will come forward to support it, and actually I'm seeing signs of that now, that there are people willing to support projects like that. So I probably will just put it out on whatever platform I could get it on, X, Substack. Not sure about YouTube. We'll probably have to make a YouTube channel, especially for documentaries, or put it on someone else's YouTube. But yeah, everyone will be able to see it in full.
Uh, would you possibly be able to get advertisers to include in there, or have you looked into it?
Maybe not for this one, but perhaps for future projects, we'll look into that. With this one, it was very kind of flying by the seat of our pants, and just like, let's just make it and see what people think of it, and see if they want to support future ones, and just get the best quality piece we can put out.
Awesome. Yeah. What about the situation in Ireland? What's going on with Conor McGregor? What's the momentum behind whatever he wants to lead?
Well, I mean, Conor McGregor wants to run for president, and that seems to be his only ambition at present. I don't think there's much of a realistic chance of him getting on the ballot because the way the system works here, you need to get nominated by a certain number of sitting members of parliament or a certain number of local councils. But of course, most of the councils are dominated by establishment parties, and there aren't 20 members of parliament that are going to support him. So I don't really see a path where he gets on the ballot. I think that's next to zero chance. But he did support the protests. There was one of them, not the last one I was at, but there was one a few months prior to that. He actually attended like prior to beginning. It began in our kind of garden of remembrance, and he was there with his family. So he has thrown his support behind those kinds of things. But with his reputation and some of the scandals he's been involved in, he's certainly more limited in what he can do in mainstream politics than Nigel Farage or Donald Trump figure. So it's still going to have to be built from the ground up if there's going to be a populist movement, I think.
Well, you're very much on the ground in Ireland and across Europe as well. So, what will that exactly look like? Like, what sort of meetings are taking place? What sort of networks? What are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do under Irish law? What does that look like?
Well, yeah, Ireland really isn't as bad as the rest of Europe. We're playing catch up in a lot of ways. I mean, I always look at the UK as the ultimate, like, just anti-white tyranny state. And we really don't have the same level of, like, the intelligence services they have that are like so directed at, you know, keeping the far right down. The hate speech laws. Of course, they tried to pass what would have been the worst hate speech laws in Europe a couple of years ago. And it was basically going through without debate. It had already passed our first House of Parliament. And around the time I got back on Twitter in April 2023, that was one thing I started hammering was how bad the Irish hate speech law is. And then Musk and Donald Trump Jr. and some other people took interest in it. And that put it into kind of mainstream news here because Ireland is very sensitive to when there's attention from these larger forces outside. It's very kind of central to our politics, especially with how reliant the country has become on outside investment and so on. So that did actually start a big debate. With that kind of window of free speech we had with X, there was a very big kind of populist movement that was able to be built behind it. And it was one of those things, it was spearheaded by nationalists, but of course you can have conservatives and libertarians and, quite moderate people that have concerns about how bad this law is got behind it. And then it became so popular right before the election, certain politicians started to jump ship and say, no, actually, I never supported this, even though they'd been voting for it for the last like 5 years as it went through all the stages into law. And then it was just kind of quietly dropped, and they passed the hate crime bill, but not the hate speech bill. And it was interesting. Recently, the EU came and said there's two countries in Europe, Ireland, and I think the other was Finland, or maybe it was Norway. I think it was Finland. Don't have proper hate speech laws. You have to have all of these elements of targeting racism and online speech, and said we have to pass that. And then there was pressure from the other side, of course, where the US State Department has basically intervened and said, like, we're concerned about what's happening with free speech in Ireland. With the Digital Services Act, which is this big overarching EU bill that's meant to control online speech, is regulated in Dublin for all of Europe, where all of the US multinational tech companies are based, like Google and Facebook and so on. So that's led the US under the Trump administration to take more of an interest in trying to push back on some of that, extreme censorship. And yeah, it looks like our government, surprisingly, is actually going to stand firm on that and not pass the hate speech laws. So, that to me is a huge win. I mean, like if we weren't, if there weren't nationalists that were on X just blasting this stuff out every day, when it looked like it was a done deal. I mean, even when I was posting about it and I was going on shows talking about it after it blew up with the Musk interaction and so on, and I was saying, well, look, it is going to pass. Like it's gone through the first House of Parliament. Traditionally, our Senate, the second House of Parliament, doesn't reject anything. So it was a done deal. And I was kind of speaking that way, but I'm like, well, at least now we have everyone aware of it, and when they start prosecuting people, we're going to be able to build up, big publicity about that. Maybe we can fund their legal cases, these kinds of things. It's going to be a lot more costly for the government to throw people in jail. Uh, I didn't know we'd achieve them actually dropping the bill. So that was, I think, a huge achievement for us, considering we don't have any great backing or institutional power behind us. And I would always use that in the future as an example of, like, it actually does matter what you do, blasting your voice out online and making things as difficult as possible for your enemy in terms of publicity and propaganda.
No, I mean, it's amazing. You really were kind of at the center of potentially undoing. Wow, my audio levels actually are jumping all over the place. I turned them down, I turned them up. People are complaining about it. Um, I'm gonna get a better setup and have everything under control in no time. But uh, but yeah, I'm sort of feeling that as well. In past years, politics felt more like a spectator sport, and it felt
Mm,
more, we would talk about ideology and very abstract things and principles. And it feels like we're at a time right now where there is an opening, there's a real like open-mindedness, even on the part of the establishment in some ways, which is really surprising. They felt so opaque, so closed off. But like in America, now the Republican Party, many of them are separating themselves from Trump. They don't want to be kind of tainted by the bad publicity associated with Epstein. And like, yeah, I mean, just speaking out against an unjust, illiberal law in Ireland seems to have started enough of a conversation. A lot of it's X, a lot of it is the social media. Um, but also, I think a generation is coming of age now, and I'm glad that we went through that kind of robust ideological think tank phase online. And I think you were a big part of that as well. So I think you deserve a lot of credit for the direction that things are going. We're all responsible for public opinion and these political trajectories, however slight our individual role is. But it feels like there is an opening for much larger impact. So I like the documentary
mhm.
idea. I'm still curious, how exactly, what does the on the ground organizing look like in Ireland now? What political parties are really promising? Who do you support? What sorts of institutions do you think would help? Where do you go from here?
Yeah, I'm supporting the National Party. I think they're really the only way forward. There's been this is one of the things is there's never been a populist right wing party in Ireland. Really, there was two big centrist parties, and there was kind of a socially conservative consensus for a long time, and they just gradually abandoned that, and you have a bunch of parties that are social liberal parties, and then a few opposition parties that are more old school social democracy, or even Trotskyist style parties. But there hasn't been a big right wing party, and that's been a strength in a sense in that as populist momentum has grown, there hasn't been some Farage type figure to make it about I don't know, illegal immigration and anti-Semitism. It's actually been kept very well onto nationalism, immigration, legal and illegal. Um, and yeah, it's in terms of the average person that's a part of it. They're very good on their priors in terms of ethnic nationalism. And you don't see that kind of fake populist right you see in other countries. As much as you can see, they're trying to force it. They're trying to build it now. Um, that's also a weakness in a sense, in that for the last few years, it's been so disorganized. There's poll after poll about how many people are opposed to mass immigration. There was a poll last year that said like almost a quarter of Irish people would support what was described as a far right party. Like it was described as an anti-immigration party, and like 1 in 4 said they'd support it. But the problem is trying to get the force off the ground in the first place that kind of stands up above all the other million little small groups that are trying to be that group and just become, this is the anti-immigration party, this is the AFD, this is the Confederacia. I don't know why it's such a problem for Ireland, but one problem is definitely boomers. They just they can't seem to cooperate on anything. There's a new party formed every week in Ireland by some boomer that thinks he's going to reinvent the wheel and has some novel idea about I don't know, the constitution, and Ireland is actually a corporation and the real country is ERA, and somehow they're the real president. This kind of like weird like sovereign citizen boomer stuff you seem to get. So boomers really dominate the movement. There is a lot of I don't know, low human capital. It's been so gatekept in terms of the conversation in academia and media more so than anywhere. So it's been very kind of disorganized, bit chaotic. But I think the trajectory the National Party is on in terms of having the most polished propaganda, they're very much the party that was most at the forefront of all of these protests, putting out the best propaganda, has a very coherent position, has someone elected to local council last year, and has the youngest membership. And all the guys are young, they get it, they they understand messaging, they're very active, they get involved in on-the-ground politics. So I think for that reason, they will outlast the others. And I'm already starting to see other people that tried other parties kind of moving towards the National Party now. But yeah, definitely the most difficult part is step one. It's trying to go from, your base is people that are involved in nationalist politics and talking about this stuff online every day, and becoming recognized across the country. Traditionally in Europe, what happens is you have a party that's kind of on the fringes like that for a while, and then it gets one parliamentary seat, and then the next election it gets 20 or 40. That's kind of the way things go. The most difficult part is always the initial breakthrough, and that's because of all of the difficulties of trying to organize people on the right and all of the different grievances they have, and try and get them on board with one message. But yeah, there's good work being done right now.
Awesome. What is the party platform, the National Party? Just simply put.
Well, it's Irish ethnic nationalism, Irish sovereignty. It's not what you would see in a lot of Europe, where it's maybe combined with, I don't know, neoliberal economics. It's much more focused on kind of more developmentalist vision, not being so reliant on outside investments. Social conservatism. It's not, explicitly like Ireland should be a Catholic country or whatever, but certainly a socially conservative Catholic person in Ireland, that would be the party for them. So yeah, it's solid ideologically, but it certainly has the potential for mass appeal with its platform.
Uh, are there a couple kind of preeminent thinkers coming from that side of things in Ireland that we should be looking at? Like,
Well, myself, of course. There's some good young activists involved with the National Party. Patrick Quinlan was elected to council last year. He's very involved in local politics. Some other guys in Dublin as well. Jan McEarty is the leader of the youth movement. He's super involved. Did quite well when he ran in general election, actually. So yeah, there's a lot of young activist guys that get it and that are up and coming.
would you say you're like the most intellectually sophisticated author in that scene, or not to? I won't even have you answer the question. It's so
Well, I mean,
presumptuous,
there
but
is a, there's Gale Twitter. There are the people that are kind of Irish language revivalists as well, and that are trying to revive a lot of old Irish texts and traditional sort of nationalist understandings of things. Um, they'd have a smaller audience. It's more of a kind of a Twitter click and Substacks. So I guess in terms of reach, maybe it's me. I mean, you have some older people that have kind of defected from the mainstream. Like there are people like John Waters, who was a very respected journalist here, like probably one of our most famous journalists. He wrote for the Irish Times, like very establishment newspaper here, and he has kind of defected from the mainstream over COVID and over immigration. But some of those older people, it's maybe less of a, I don't know, it's less of a ideologically nationalist rejection of the system, and it can be just a kind of collection of different grievances with the system.
Yeah, I would like to see ideological tome that sets the future of Irish nationalism on course. I feel like you can do it. Your book is very good. Again, nationalism, the politics of identity. He's a humble guy. He's not going to admit to that. But I think it's Keith.
I did
Dogma.
release the collection of Irish nationalist writings a few months ago. I was surprised it hadn't been done. Actually, I was looking for something like that, and I realized there are individual nationalists in Irish history, like Pádraig Pearse, that have books of their writings released, but no one's ever just made an anthology. And there's a lot of individual thinkers that were very influential. Some of them just wrote letters and essays and so on. But they've really been neglected by academia here, by publishers here. So I thought that was a worthwhile endeavor to put those together in one book.
Mhm. One of my long run projects that I'd like to see realized is some kind of school and media center. You're working on documentaries on your own now, and I think that's great. Um, is there anything in the works or anything in the nationalist scene resembling some kind of like ideological institution or hub for thinkers and training the next generation of thinkers?
Not that I can think of, no.
No? Okay. Do you think that would be beneficial?
Well, I haven't given it a whole lot of thought. Um, I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that. I mean, you certainly think it would be beneficial.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I think the Frankfurt School was, sometimes it's overblown in the significance of the domination of the left in the last century, but I think that's how they infiltrated academia. And I don't think it's just a matter of professional networking and nepotism. I think it's also having physical institutions where intellectuals can gather to kind of summon a greater spirit and coherence. Um, one of the things I'm thinking more about as RTTL as an organization is putting out media and engaging in a broader conversation, not just myself, is the alignment or coherence of what we're stating publicly. So we're being forced to
Hmm.
reflect on, style guide sorts of principles, also talking points, things that mainstream political parties have to think about. We're not a political party, and it's not per se political what we're doing, but it's just my first kind of taste of the real world necessity of ideological coherence, speaking on behalf of like one block. And I think physical institutions have the potential of doing that better than anything else, especially when it comes to the more ideological side, not the simple talking points, because people can meme that online. Um, I've been thinking of this is sort of a philosophical aside, but I've been thinking of two regimes basically of communication in language, the domain of noesis and domain of mimesis. And some parts of language are communicated just by habit and just by these kind of bodily aspects. And then others are communicated by the realm of forms, like in a Platonic sense. So that has to meet somewhere. Meet like memeing can be done uh using ideas. They always interact, but when like the mimesis leads, it ideas permeate into the material world more so than when noesis leads. But I do think, just like Plato's hierarchy in the soul, there has to be some kind of superordinate, subordinate relationship between the two regimes. And so I think that's one of the reasons that think tanks, schools are so effective, is that it bridges the gap from that domain of noesis into the domain of mimesis. Another way it happens is one really influential political thinker writes some tome, and then a lot of followers read it, like, Hitler's Mein Kampf. one of the reasons I think their party was so successful was because he set all of this stuff out in a way that was easy for the public to internalize, and that created a common spirit. Um, I think it can also be done with institutions, and I think it's more robust when it's done with institutions. I'm not one of the people who thinks that Hitler did nothing wrong. I think he made a lot of mistakes personally, and I think it's because it was a cult of personality around him, and there wasn't enough institutional slow growth and ideological self-reflection. It was sort of hodgepodge on the basis of, well, this guy has power. That's my take. I know it's a very unpopular take in these circles, but anyway. So I think that's why institutions like that tend to do well. What else, like on the ground?
I mean, it's
Um,
more difficult when you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about doing it with like the best thinkers in Europe or something, I mean, it's just an issue with geography, especially if they're involved in nationalist movements and organizations, like they have something tying them to their own country. So, to have like a centralized institution that covers Europe or something, I don't know. And also, I mean, the best people, the people that are good enough to engage in that kind of work, like I feel like they are going to find ways to collaborate on that and find those answers with what we have now in terms of through the internet, through these kinds of communities. Um, I don't know. I mean, the Frankfurt School, yeah, it was very influential, but these are people that were existing academics that were training future generations. Some of them had CIA funding and funding from very large institutions. I don't know. I just wonder how much that would scale if you did that.
yeah, I don't know that the institution would even need to scale. I also want to see it. Uh, I pitched the same idea when I spoke with Nick Fuentes recently. The media house and think tank in one institution. Um, Maybe that's my nostalgia from the more, uh, you know, ideological phase of what we're all doing online. But I think creating like a social environment that is also ideological will lead to a new level of understanding of, nationalist principles or identitarian principles, or like integrating things together. One of the things I've noticed this year is, like, after being exposed to these ideas for so long, now finally, like, the physiological side of how you react to, racism, or, socially taboo views of history, it's finally kind of breaking down. And I wasn't even
Mhm.
conscious of it, because ideologically, from that realm of noesis, it seemed I was persuaded, 10 years ago by a lot of arguments. And I didn't, I guess, understand how deep those liberal priors really ran. And sometimes it would manifest in an idea that wasn't coherent with the rest of my worldview. And then I would, check myself and bring coherence and reflect on priors that I hadn't thought about. But it goes deeper than the level of ideas. It goes into just that spiritual level. So I think, yeah, there's something to the physical shared space that allows a spirit to flow like that. And, I've also noticed it living here in community, obviously, with people who share my views, not having to hide what I think. And it's a different situation, in Ireland, your views aren't so taboo that you can't organize publicly. Patriot Front has to wear masks. We believe in free speech here, and in some ways, maybe we have even better free speech laws than many parts of Europe, but the social consequences are still extreme. And we don't have that. We're on this vast continent, and um, so we don't like live in that shared spirit in the same way that a small nation state would. So I think, like, a media house will just create a vibe that will be contagious. It's not so much that it needs to scale, it's just that that needs to happen. That's the content that I want to see. I want content that is wedded to like on the ground projects and seeing that social dimension. There were too many talking heads, like literal just isolated talking heads using internet connections only for too long. And there are podcasts and things where people get together, and I like seeing that, but there's nothing that's into. Successful institutions need to have a life of their own, and people should, people who aren't performing as well should drop out, and new talent should be able to enter in. Um, so that's kind of where my head is at, and that's the kind of thing I'd like to do in the US, as a tangent, pretty unrelated to RTTL. With RTTL, it's more communities, recreational properties, community centered to work on that. But the think tank, the media house, that Frankfurt School for the Right or something, I just can't let the idea go.
Yeah, just as an aside, your audio is like dropping and coming back very loud, so you might want to check if you have like an
Ye-
automatic volume adjustment on
I
or something. I
mean,
don't know.
the settings are set and it's just randomly. I think my physical connection on that cord is bad. I'm gonna get a new setup and it's gonna be good,
Okay.
but it's just, yeah, it's
Uh,
brutal.
yeah, I do think there's potential for um yeah, certainly centralizing the media more. I mean, Red Eyes had quite a big impact back in the day. And like, yeah, a big part of that was just that they had a studio, they had very professionally produced clips that would cover the news and current events. It looked like you were watching a mainstream news network or something. You see some of these organizations now, like GB News in the UK, can reach quite a big audience with the content they're putting out. Even Lotus Eaters in the UK has had quite a big impact. I think it's Sargon of Akkad runs that. But I've noticed the conversation shift a lot in Britain in the last few years. And I think a big part of that was that you have this more centralized thing with Lotus Eaters and maybe some crossover with GB News and some of these orgs. And there's kind of cross pollination of like, more dissident thinkers, people that would traditionally be like considered dissident right, and then more mainstream people. You'll have like David Starkey or some of these people come on. So yeah, I think yeah, on a Europe-wide scale, you could have some kind of centralized media organization that could produce high-quality movies, documentaries, on-the-ground reporting. Like I said, one of the bigger obstacles is just that, of course, people are going to be focused on the orgs in their own countries, and there's always like a certain limit to kind of cross-border cooperation in Europe, and just the problems created by geography and so on. But definitely, if you have a few people that are very excellent, um, and that are able to centrally coordinate and cover European events from that pro-white perspective, I think there is potential with that for sure.
So, on the religious side of things, how do you think Catholicism and then just the state of religion among the Irish people is playing into the nationalist movement?
Well, I mean, I don't think a whole lot, honestly. I mean, I think I wrote an article on secularization last year, and I used to kind of take for granted some of these memes you hear on the right about how Gen Z is becoming religious. Um, Ed Dutton wrote a book about this, The Past is a Future Country, talking about birth rates leading to greater religiosity. And this idea that we reached peak secularization and now we're going to head for a more religious future. A lot of the people I read on this topic were like critics of the secularization thesis. But the more I looked into it, the more I found that was kind of lacking. And I actually think it's the opposite. I think we are heading towards more secularization. I think a lot of the memes you hear repeated about that, in terms of conversions or some of the statistics that are used are misleading. Like, this is kind of an aside, but when you get into debates about secularization, people will always use like the example of the US as like this is proof to secularization thesis is wrong because X amount of people identify as religious, and modernity and capitalism hasn't made them less religious, and there was religious revivals in the late 20th century and so on. But actually, if you look at that, one of the big things in surveys is that people just lie. They lie about how religious they are. They lie about how often they attend church. And the actual worthwhile studies on this, if you just put aside what people say, there was a couple of studies that traced people by their phone connections, like if they were attending church. And in the US, you'll get about a quarter of people that say they go to church every Sunday. The number is actually 4 or 5%. So secularization is increasing everywhere. Yeah, there are religious people on the Irish right, certainly, and if you're a Catholic conservative, you're probably going to be drawn to the nationalist movement now because your ideas aren't going to be represented anywhere else by any of the other major parties. But I really don't see this trend. Some people see that Gen Z is going to be this very conservative Christian generation, and we're going to have a revival in Christian nationalism or something. I think it's misled by, in terms of like, okay, maybe the people you'll see that will rise to be influencers will have a more like complete worldview in terms of religion and everything else. But to me, secularization is advancing very rapidly in Ireland, in Poland, where it just was, in every country. But support for nationalist policies, support for immigration restriction and remigration remains. And yeah, I can't say that I think it's going to be something that's going to propel nationalist movements that they're representing the Christian side of things or something, because any data I've seen on that suggests the opposite.
So, what do you think the appropriate role of religion ought to be then? In RTTL, we're sort of neutral on traditional European religions. We are against foreign religions. We don't, not that we like are opposed to their existence per se. It's just that we don't want them in our private association. It's a European heritage club, essentially, but we tolerate agnostics too. So I think that's the modus vivendi that nationalist groups or far right groups that I've gotten involved with tend to fall into. So is that, do we just kind of remain neutral on that ground? Does that open up the seeds for conflict in the future? Again, returning to what was happening in National Socialist Germany, that question was negotiated very carefully, and they kind of articulated this positive Christianity ideal. I don't know how successful it was. It feels like that also is this kind of hodgepodge solution that never really took off, and the spirit wasn't there. They were like quasi pagan, but also Christian, and it just what kind of balance would you like to see struck on that front, specifically like as it comes to the National Party and the role that that social movement plays vis-a-vis religion.
Well, I mean, I certainly think nationalist movements in the West and Europe should be, pro-Christianity. I mean, the we're so informed by the values of Christianity. I mean, even right down to the absolute, anti-Abrahamic neo-pagans. I mean, if you look at their worldview, you'll find it's a lot more informed by Christianity than they would like to admit. So, yeah, I think like as a principle, Islam, Judaism, foreign religions. I mean, there's an element to them where they're not just religious faiths, but they contain like a kind of group evolutionary strategy with them that isn't compatible with European civilization, with the norms we've developed that are partly, from our own biology and how we shaped religion ourselves, but also just that we've adapted to the religion. So yeah, it should be somewhat pro-Christian, and obviously that's going to be a part of the kind of case we're making is very powerful to people to see Christian Europe being transformed towards Islam, seeing mosques replacing churches and so on. Um, and with Ireland as well, obviously the Catholic identity is much more part of nationalist history here in terms of how it's informed identity and the conflict with Protestant outsiders. But just speaking from my own perspective, anyway, I don't see a nationalist movement becoming sectarian, either benefiting it or even giving it any kind of path towards popularity or real power. I mean, even take Catholics in the US, two-thirds of Catholics in the US support abortion, right? Again, this is the thing people will talk about how religious people are and use like raw numbers of what they report on a census. But the point of secularization is that religious values don't inform people. People aren't taking it as their ultimate arbiter of how they decide moral and political issues. And yeah, two-thirds of Catholics in the US support abortion. 11% of them think the US should promote Christian values. So 89% of Catholics in the US don't think their country should promote Christian values. So there really isn't a strong base of support for that. Again, there's a strong base of support for protecting Christian values and protecting Christianity, and the fact that you have places like the UK where people are being put in jail for saying prayers outside abortion clinics and so on. I mean, just these absurd scenarios. But I don't see a path forward where there's suddenly going to be a demand for a change on the scale of mass society, where people are going to want to move back to restrictive Christian values and a Christian government. Like implicitly, so if you're in a country like Poland, yes, it's still quite Catholic, rapidly changing, but as someone that doesn't hold that belief myself, I just can't, and as someone that just doesn't see that there's any real support for that, I just can't recommend that as a path forward.
So what do you think the attitude should be on the part of the National Party, let's say, towards religion? Similar to the stance that RTTL has taken, or what do you think?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's different if you have an intentional community. I mean, the stance of the National Party, as far as I know, is that Ireland is like going to officially be a Catholic country, and this is officially like a Catholic government that's going to be ruled according to the dictates of the church or something. But recognizing that it is, at least nominally, a majority Christian country, and that's a big part of the tradition and the way social values have been informed here. And of course, I would say a majority of the members. I can't be sure on that, but probably a majority of their members hold the Christian faith as well. So.
Okay, so it'll kind of remain subtextual and implicit and not be a focal point, essentially. Do you think there's some alternative spiritual current that is popular among the Irish youth that might be relevant in the future?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I'm increasingly blackpilled on that whole question. I mean, um, I read an interesting theorist last year called Jan Assmann. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was an Egyptologist, but he talked about the mosaic distinction of how much Christianity changed our understanding of religion, in terms of there used to be this understanding of things, that there was a pluralism of gods and forces and forms of worship, but that it was all part of a coherent kind of monist worldview that he called cosmotheism. And that there basically was like one sort of metaphysics is where you get the perennial philosophy from, that informed the ancient world across diverse religious perspectives, and that the Abrahamic distinction of saying that there were true and false gods kind of ruptured this permanently, and it kind of fundamentally changed our understanding of the supernatural in a way that he kind of lamented, but also said it couldn't ever be recovered. That kind of Mosaic distinction view of things. So, I look at like the neo-pagan movements and so on, and I just don't see, for a variety of reasons, I just don't really see much motion there in terms of them reaching any kind of support either. So, I don't know. I mean, Heidegger has a famous quote where he said, "Only a God can save us." And like when I look at the religion thing, it's like, I don't know. We can theorize about it all we want, but there are forces much greater than us that decide those kinds of shifts, and I don't think a political movement can really engineer that.
No, I guess it can only comport itself relative to movements that are happening in a deeper level. Um, I think that modus vivendi that I talked about before is a workable situation, and tolerance between traditional European religious perspectives is
Hmm.
actually progress. I think obviously the wars of religion led to liberal orders um, many people would say, because people were just so sick of constant conflict. They wanted diplomatic solutions and this live and let live and respect our differences, and nationalism really emerged out of that. But are we just kind of in a similar space now, but with kind of more religious diversity in the sense that atheism, agnosticism, New Age spirituality, that sort of thing is also popular. I don't think there are many atheists, really. Like secularism,
Yeah.
I don't completely buy it because most young people that I talk to have some inclination of higher powers, or at least, mystic forces active in the world. Maybe they're animistic, if not theistic. Um, and I don't know exactly how you engage with that,
Right. Well, this is
except
one thing.
tolerance.
This is one thing people have used to argue against the secularization thesis. Actually, there is truth to it. Is if you poll people, they're actually not much more atheistic than they were a couple of decades ago. And if even if you pull them on kind of I don't know, woo beliefs, supernatural beliefs, like an awful lot of people believe in spirits, in ghosts, and the ability to predict the future, whatever, all these kinds of things, like what would be like new age beliefs. To the point that actually among Gen Z, I think that's almost like a majority view. Like if you were to just break it down like by belief, like what's the philosophy here rather than like nominally what faith they profess, that's kind of the majority view. It's just some kind of vague pantheism, mix of kind of new age beliefs. But the reason the secularization thesis is still true is that it's really a question of how much of an authority religion is. And people that have those beliefs, they don't really serve as an authority for how they engage with politics or morality. They still have a secular starting point. It's still, live and let live, liberalism. In other words, it's politically what it cashes out to is the same as if they were atheist or agnostic. But yeah, I think the way we're wired, and just the fundamental nature of things that we intuit, I don't think people will ever be like majority atheists. The Richard Dawkins perspective is never going to be the majority. People always will be theistic and have these kinds of supernatural beliefs. But what's collapsing is it being formed around centralized religious authority. And it's really hard for me to imagine how that's going to be reversed. I think intentional communities and the birth rates, yes, groups like the Mormons and the Amish, with their birth rates, they're going to become a much higher percentage of the population. Who's the Jewish author? Is it Kaufman? I think the guy that wrote White Shift has a book about that. The religious shall inherit the earth. Still become a larger percent of the population, but even then, those are typically like smaller, more fundamentalist sects, even foreign groups that are in the West. And it doesn't really cohere into one centralized thing. And even there, they'll still vote in ways where they don't really care if things like, abortion or gay marriage are legal on a national level. But they have their values for their community and they're able to kind of protect that and enforce that within themselves. So how that would ever translate to, mass society, centralized states are going to like reinstitute Christian values. I don't even believe that's really possible in the current epoch, just given the nature of things technologically, socially.
Yeah, I think that relates maybe to some of the decentralizing tendencies, you're looking at a broader scale. And I think you probably would put the main driver on technology. Is that correct,
Yeah,
first of all? Yeah. And I think it's like I have a very two-sided relationship to technology, which I'm clearly bad at. I acknowledge the audio issues. It's just sorry, I'm gonna figure it out. We'll figure it out. Um, but on the other hand, we have this kind of competitive marketplace, not just of ideas, especially with AI and, fact checkers used to be sort of a vehicle of the establishment, but now it's the ability to immediately bring in substantial sources to add to or subtract from an argument that's being made. It's making everyone a little bit more objective. I don't know if you feel the same way, but it's more data intensive than it has been in the past. I think a lot of that's AI. You know, people have access to smart search as opposed to dumb search, and it'll just give people answers. I think that was a huge barrier to the flow of information. Was just people didn't, it's not that they didn't know how to find it, it's just that it was scattered. It wasn't just given to them. It wasn't in the right format. It needs to be kind of personal. You ask a question, it tells you here's the truth. So community notes on X, that functions in a similar way. And if I'm going to look at those tendencies with the evolution of religion, I kind of went with this same line in a video I did about the future of religion a few years ago, where I don't think a new central authority is the way. I don't think the old central authority, simply returning to them, is the way, because I think we can have critical historical appraisals of the texts of the Bible, of the history of the Catholic Church, of the history of Protestant churches. This is an age of skepticism in institutions, and we're seeing that just put on display with what's happening with Trump now. And in in the aftermath of that, or in that, with that decaying edifice, people now are looking to a source of authority in decentralized scientific objectivity, which I like. That's the way that I engage philosophically, the way that I've always tried to engage openness to debate. It's not at the level that I would prefer, where people are willing to engage interpersonally and talk to the opposition. That still hasn't quite happened, but there is an openness to data and availability, accessibility of data, that I think, if applied to religion, will lead to a deeper understanding of our heritage and where we're coming from. If there are Catholic partisans or Orthodox partisans who think their view is the true view, well, they should be willing to go ahead and go through this process of analyzing the actual evidence we have of the history of the church. They should be willing to engage in that kind of critical appraisal. Even if they side on the side of these institutions, I think there's that kind of dialectical process that can play out and then change the way we interact with spirituality in a more fundamental way than some new religion. I think meaningful religious change always reflects upon previous religious movements. Christianity grows out of, well, kind of two sources. One, Hellenistic Platonism, Middle Platonism, and on the other hand, Judaism, or Buddhism growing out of Hinduism, um, and this sort of thing. And I think de novo religion has no shot, and maybe like a separate category has no shot. They talk about these different consciousness structures. Who's the author? The Ever-Present Origin.
Gebser, John Gebser.
Gepser, yeah. Um, so we've gone through mythic consciousness, rational consciousness. Rational consciousness obviously deals with categorical distinctions, dividing nature up, and that's fine, but that's only one part of Plato's dialectical process. We also have to go all the way up to what unifies things and then go back down from there. So that integral phase maybe will come with less of a concrete distinction between the religious and political and scientific and historical. And I think it can all be wrapped into a kind of process of collective self knowledge that AI is greatly facilitating. So we've talked about AI before. And as far as like,
I
is
mean,
it
I'll just
conscious?
say,
Is it
I'll
all
just
that
take
sort of
you up on
thing?
that. I mean,
Sure.
I'm
Yeah.
more skeptical of that because I think what you're describing, I think maybe applies to like 4 or 5% of the population in terms of if you're smart and you're capable and you have this academic tendency. I mean, AI is fantastic. Like I use it for all sorts of research. It's really a great tool. If I had it like 10, 15 years ago, I could have learned so much more, so much faster. And yes, things like community notes, there have been these ways of kind of collectively enforcing truth and fact checking. But for 95% of people, I think AI is just going to make them more stupid and more illiterate. It's like the at Grok, is this true? People you see in the replies, these like NPC types. And I think actually more the tendency you get with social media and with this like decentralized norm now is people are much more free to just choose their source of authority uh, without any real adjudication of, there's no peer review process or not really a critical way of looking at it. And then that person just kind of provides them with whatever they need to block out opposing viewpoints. This is like why flat Earth got so popular. It's like flat Earthers always existed, but they were probably quiet about their beliefs. They were probably a bit embarrassed. But then they can get together in a community and they can have a few of their more intelligent members can make YouTube channels and give them like ready-made answers to the objections. And then you just have a bunch of people who are like very confident in their flat eartherism. I think people are increasingly illiterate. I think AI is going to contribute to that. People aren't doing any college essays or any writing in school anymore. AI is going to do all their homework. No one reads anymore. People's attention spans are fried. Um, and I increasingly find, you know, even with the social media change the last couple of years, it's like people have their like collection of red pills and their collection of like trusted people that they get their views from, and increasingly they can't really engage outside of that. Like, just to use a recent example, right? So I posted the article arguing for the authenticity of Hitler's table talks. This is like a source of debate. Like, are the table talks legit source? Because you have like Christian NS people that want to say Hitler like shared their religious beliefs, or these people that think Hitler was like a pan-European that want to deny that like he had intentions to colonize Eastern Europe and so on. But I would see these objections pop up like, oh, the table talks are fake, they can't use them as a source. I just did like an article looking into that and why actually they do stand up as a source, not verbatim, but they are corroborated by a lot of other recordings, and you can very confidently use them to document a lot of his thinking. But I got like 500 replies on the tweet. Probably 90% of them were negative. But I'd say maybe like 5% of people actually opened the article. And typically now what you just get is someone will just link like someone that agrees with them that's posted a screenshot that they don't know the source of the screenshot. They don't know what the context is. They don't know if that's even addressed in the argument you've made, and they're just kind of content with that. And of course they have their own like group of people that share their perspective to amplify it. So it's easier than ever to be wrong, and it's easier than ever to just take a position that you want to be true, that feels good, and you can find somewhat intelligent, presentable people that will give you all manner of serious looking stuff that supports it, and you never really have your view challenged. And then of course there's no centralized academic debate about this stuff that you're getting your views from. There's no trusted experts. There's no peer review process. So similar process as to what's happening with religion, in terms of people can just take the kind of cafeteria of beliefs and choose which things they like, have a bit of spirit communication, a bit of pantheism, a bit of reincarnation. And that's basically like how people are approaching everything now. And I'm not sure there's a way out of that. I'm not sure you're going to subjugate like the 90% of people to be like, no, actually, we need some centralized way to adjudicate these truth claims, and then you need to like follow us when we come up with the truth. Um, there is. I'm optimistic about like, you can see new atheism kind of died a death in recent years, and if you look at the intellectual spaces of people that are taking philosophy and science and the intersection seriously, it's guys you've interacted with. You find these guys like John Vervaeke, who's built a big audience. Even Jordan Peterson originally was tapping into that a little bit, but these guys like John Vervaeke, Bernardo Kastrup became quite popular with presenting metaphysical idealism, and all of these kinds of intelligent challenges to materialism. I think you find with intelligent philosophical people, they're going back to that. They're going back to kind of an ancient worldview in terms of basically falling on monism, idealism, things that would align with Platonism, and those ideas mentioned earlier, like the perennial philosophy. But how does that translate down to the 95% of people that would have typically in the past gotten reviews from some dogma that was handed to them and now get it from whichever influencer they like? I don't know if there is a path to align those things anymore.
That's actually a very good point. I do think, though, the 4%, 5% of people that will productively use AI like you would to learn a lot more than they otherwise could, that's a way more powerful driver, big picture than low IQ people using it foolishly. Like they're going to use pretty much any technology that way. And yes, it will create a larger divide, and people will be able to get by without having this kind of basic inculcation into the Western tradition, but also like as a part of that, just basic math, skills that they should know. Incompetence is on the rise. I remember being a kid and like dealing with cashiers, and they could count. They could figure out the change. And now increasingly, people can't just do the basic stuff. They put the button in, or they push the button on the machine, and it spits out the answer, and that's it. So that's very true. And dysgenics are still kind of a driving factor, and we have the reverse Flynn effect. I don't think that's going to be turned around. But just like late antiquity, there was a general decline in intelligence uh, in conjunction with this ascendancy of a very sophisticated philosophical school in relatively centralized institutions, but that had a method that was a little bit more, um, scientific, and anyone could contribute to it. Certainly, the scholarch is a very hierarchical role, and we would have to do something very different. But I guess what I'm outlining is the possibility, just like that think tank, media center project, a similar idea in spirit, the New Frankfurt School. It's that the thought leaders who are capable of a kind of scientific detachment when it comes to all these different areas, religion and political theory, sociological theory, and just worldview, and you know physics, ultimately, like all the sciences should be integrated in this like ideal uh college of the new age that I think would be beneficial. uh I don't know how realistic that is. That's utopian. People aren't going to integrate everything, but I think we're gonna get there closer than we ever have, because a certain percentage of people will use AI hyper productively. They are using it that way now. So, like, the smartest people are going to be smarter than they ever have been. And I don't think that's easy to predict what the results will be, especially since it's not just AI, it's also best practices in all these institutions. The state of the art in a lot of things is just a lot further advanced than it used to be, including when it comes to religious studies, like within the Catholic Church, hermeneutics and scholarly treatment of the sources and manuscript analysis. It's far more advanced than it was a century ago. um, so I think that opens up a space, and it's not something that'll happen automatically, just like we were saying before, or I was saying that politics was more a spectator thing a few years ago. Now it's like, no, what we're doing will actually impact the world when it comes to this, how we treat religion, political theory. Either we use the available technology to set up this kind of community of scholars, and not equals in every respect. It needs to be hierarchical and sensitive to differences in merit and quality of work. But I think that there is a general tone among a certain class of intellectual that is less partisan, less biased than it used to be. Some people double down and are like more closed-minded than ever, sure, but I think overall the impact of AI on maybe not that 4%, but maybe like 1% of people will be to hone in on an ideal way of comprehending the Western tradition. That's also, I think, as far as my, media stuff going forward, I've always talked about the ancient past. I'd like to do more projects like the history of the West, starting with Charlemagne. In a lot of ways, that's the beginning of Western civilization. We could get a better self-comprehension of those things than we ever have in the past. I remember listening to panel discussions on historical topics through voice chats that you couldn't have had a few decades ago, and you got this really robust, rich treatment of all of these niche historical topics because they could have different people specialize in different areas, and it was also free flowing, and ideas and a spirit was there. Um, but now with AI, with enhanced research tools, um, as long as the attitude is right and as long as the priorities are right, I think the potential for putting out media and impacting what people believe is extraordinary. It's just, does that elite use AI intelligently? And in a way, it's sort of good that the majority are just becoming more authoritarian and biased and partisan, because then if you can get the well-managed, open-minded elite of scholarly people, scientific people together putting out this propaganda of the true worldview, well, then the masses or a certain subset of them will just absorb that as the new dogma. And it's not something that you have to make up. It's something that we have to study. It's like, let's find the objective truth of religious history, as opposed to, I'm like a partisan perennialist. And like, this is just I think that's a default attitude that people have with regard to ideology. But, when you read a book by a really good author, really intelligent author, there's a kind of detachment where maybe privately they do have some stance, but there's like, I can weigh all these things and set them out on the table and be objective and dispassionate about them. That's a little bit harder to attain, but I think a larger number of elite minds will be able to attain it if we create the right social circumstance for that.
Yeah, I am skeptical. I'm still skeptical about how it gets translated to the masses outside that small circle. I mean, I guess that's something you can't exactly foresee, but you kind of just say, well, elite theory, if you have the right people on board, it'll find a way to spread itself. It'll find a way to implement it. But one thing is, I think you're maybe too optimistic about AI, that it can be used to find this, one true view, and that this will spread among the kind of cognitive elite. I think it's going to be used much more instrumentally than that, and that you can really hone in on whatever your niche is and just master that, rather than having this more complete perspective on things that people used to be given true education, because they didn't have a world of a million alternatives of niche subjects and interests that they could look at and specialize in. And then also the nature of the elite. I mean, it's like, we have a mercantile elite at present. And even the people that are kind of turning on the system, like you look at someone like Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or some of these people, I mean, there doesn't seem to be much of a philosophical depth there. Like even someone like Musk, who is,
I uh
to
I
me,
disagree about
he's
Thiel,
obviously
actually.
super high. Yeah, maybe I'm harsh on Thiel. He has a bit of a background, right? He's written on like Girard, and he's like well educated on Strauss and stuff. But still, he seems to have a very kind of, in terms of his politics, it doesn't seem super inspiring. But like someone like Musk is like obviously super high IQ and very capable and very productive. But there isn't a lot of philosophical depth there. I mean, he takes his philosophy from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That's like his life philosophy that guides him. And yeah, I mean the autists that are super, I should say that's harsh. The people that are super interested in metaphysics and finding the correct answer to these questions, uh, are those the kinds of people that we think are going to be the power brokers in the future? I don't know. I'm skeptical.
Well, yeah, it's not guaranteed. It's an opening, I think. Like RTTL, for instance, probably would not have been possible before AI research unless you had a team of lawyers up front, which we didn't. We were able to bootstrap this because we could learn how to legally do it more efficiently with AI tools and help,
Mm.
draft documents that otherwise would be really difficult to get accomplished. Um, so So I think it just opens up a lot of doors, especially with creative work, especially with scholarly work. And so it lowers the barrier to entry for people without funding um, to, well, have access to this massive amount of information. It accelerates how much you can learn. Many people won't use it that way. But if you want to really understand the basic intuitions behind relativity or quantum mechanics, you can just get on a a voice, call with ChatGPT or whatever they call that, where it's like a live voice interaction. That's what I prefer to use typically. But it will engage with you better on those subjects and give you simpler, easier to understand explanations than most college professors. I think it's a better teacher already in those technical subjects, and it does lower that barrier to entry significantly. So it's about using the tool well, which a lot of people won't do. It won't happen by default. But if you hypothetically you get a group that is better educated than others in the past, this is why you need a school as well. You need like young guys to be given the time and space to use these tools for their own development, because simultaneously economic pressures are ratcheting down, and now people won't have this prolonged adolescence that millennials had, where their entire 20s was kind of waffling. And now it's like people will have to work when they're 21, whether they like it or not. So I think creating a space where that kind of liberal education can still take place will allow then a generation of scholars that can have a more comprehensive and more true worldview than in the past, and also they'll be able to make really, really high quality media about it thanks to AI tools once again. So, like, if I wanted to do some history thing on Charlemagne, well, now AI will make really cool animations or even like live action type renditions of historical events that have never had this kind of theatrical treatment. People aren't aware of, Alfred the Great and things like that in detail. They don't remember it because no really high budget Hollywood movie was released on the subject. So, and then the same kind of applies to other aspects of networking and finance and how we organizing. We've been up against an elite that has gate kept these tools for organizing financially, in education, in media production, and now all of these things, the barrier to entry is lower. It's part of decentralization, right? So it's not guaranteed. It's just there's an opening now for those who are willing to organize intelligently to do it better than ever before.
Yeah, I agree with that. It'll be easier for intelligent people to self-educate on whatever topic they choose, but the trend I see in the other direction is it's going to be more splintered in terms of the niche interests people pursue, in terms of how splintered communities communicate with each other and try to find any common truth between opposing worldviews. And yeah, I mean, you can make high profile, high value content productions on those topics, but you'll be competing with the AI generated content on a million other topics as well. I mean, maybe it's a question of like how powerful you think the truth is in terms of its capacity to unite people across these bonds. But I just see the direction of things right now with people increasingly being siloed off epistemologically, and I'm just less optimistic about those divides being bridged till the next big era totally changes things in a way we can't imagine.
Yeah, I think the factionalism will continue. That's a given. I guess there will be one faction that gets closest to the truth, and that's the one we need to find ourselves in, and that's the one we need to strengthen. And I think institutions like the one I'm talking about, or the ones I'm talking about, would be the way to go. That's my opinion, but I'm interested in what other sorts of institutions, what other sorts of new applications of novel technologies, novel organizing principles, um, new social media opportunities, etc. would be beneficial, whatever people think. So let's get back to reality, like existing reality. I still want to know a little bit more, like what does on the ground nationalist activism in Ireland look like right now? Is it gatherings? Like how much time are you spending with people? Do you guys have meals together? Like what do you all do?
Well, it's a mix of things. I mean, take the National Party, for example. I mean, the youth group has a lot of in real life get-togethers for things like fitness and hiking trips. They recently hiked Croagh Patrick in Ireland, which is this traditional pilgrimage people do. One of the big things again has been these protests where it's quite beneficial in the sense that you're there with 20,000 people and no one has the fear of like, I'm going to go out with this small nationalist group and maybe we'll be attacked by Antifa, maybe we'll all be doxxed, this kind of thing. It's like you're there with 20,000 people. There is that strength in numbers. So that's been a very powerful kind of activism, is like being at the forefront of those protests with the, re-migration banners and very polished media content that follows that. There's been local protests against the asylum seeker centers that are built in all parts of the country. And again, there's a way to be involved on the ground in that in terms of, showing up at local community meetings that are discussing this or local protests that happen. A lot of members came into the party through that. It's like they see National Party come and represent them when every other party is denouncing them, and it's like, okay, there's someone here that's on our side. Um, and then, it's the traditional things. I mean, there was an election last year, and it's the, leafleting and, the door-to-door knocks and stuff, which, with social media, I think it increasingly has less and less return, and it is increasingly people are forming their views from the social media platforms they use. And, the TV watchers and the newspaper readers are pretty hard to shake out of their voting patterns and their beliefs. But yeah, it's a mix of activism of the kind you find with other nationalist parties in Europe. The active club model has become more popular in recent years. You see that in other parts of continental Europe, like go back to like Dries van Langenhove. He's involved with the youth movement there, and they have gyms. They have all their own sorts of organizations and get-togethers, and provide services for their own people. Little things like Thierry Baudet in the Netherlands. I forget the exact name of his political party, but they have initiatives like, they have an app where you want a plumber, you can hire a guy who's a member of the party to be your plumber. And I think their party is like 60 or 80,000 members. It's the highest membership party in the Netherlands. I met him last month, really impressive guy. So there's increasingly things like that developing. Another thing I saw that was interesting when I was in Portugal last year at the conference for the Reconquista group there is they're trialing ways of using the internet to encourage activism, where like they have a centralized platform where you kind of upload your activism and it's recorded, and there's kind of a decentralized way to reward like local movement leaders, like you're doing more activism than anyone else. And then that's a way for donors and sponsors to provide rewards to people that are especially successful and have like an end of year rewards type thing. So yeah, I mean it's a mix of media content, of underground activism, of trying to be present at the kind of more significant momentous events that are going to be the talk of the news cycle. And yeah, just building local organization, local connections. A big part of Irish politics especially is just the kind of recognizability and likability of individual political candidates rather than ideological voting. So a lot of it is just the kind of the kind of stuff I would find very boring and frustrating of door knocking and being in touch with locals and so on. Like the guy who got elected, Patrick Quinlan, was very good at that in terms of he just spent years, with a list of his constituents and like visiting them and figuring out their problems and trying to find ways to address that. And then he was rewarded by being elected. So you have to start with a small activist organization. You have to start at the lowest level in terms of becoming trusted within a community. And of course, the social media drives. There's a lot of good content creators in Ireland right now, specifically like people like Michael McCarthy. He's getting like millions of views on his videos about immigration. So that's driving the kind of meta-political cultural change. And then, the hope is that you have a force that becomes recognized on the ground as the representative of that view, and eventually that translates to seats, that translates to force in mainstream media to give you more of a voice, and then the kind of lockout the cordon sanitaire that's there, and then eventually you become a force in national politics.
Right. What does the door knocking actually look like? Like, what sort of approach? Have you been engaged in that yourself? Have you gone along with
Yeah,
other people
yeah,
who have done it?
yeah. I did some of that last year for the there was a local and European election that was scheduled at the same time. Yeah, I mean, people are generally pretty friendly and receptive. It, it, I don't know how much it really translates into votes, and then people just, I think for the majority of people, like they get election candidates door knocking, and they just say, "Yeah, thanks very much," and kind of get on with their day. And if you want, like at the end of the day, you're trying to transfer someone's voting pattern that they've maybe had for like 40 or 50 years. It's very difficult, and they're going right back to watching TV and reading newspapers. So there really does have to be that broader cultural shift driven by media. Um, but the responses really aren't as negative as you'd think. I mean, I remember one guy it's actually an English guy, started like screaming fascist and Nazi at his door. He had like three big dogs that were like trying to jump over the gate, and he was like screaming his head off as we like walk through the estate. But that's like the only thing that stands out. For the most part, it's actually quite positive. Typically, people agree with the issues. Um, a lot of times, you'll find they say things like, yeah, I agree, but what can you guys do? What can you do as a single candidate? Just this kind of apathy or hopelessness. And the typical voter doesn't look at it in this kind of ideological way, where it's like, well, the country's going in the wrong direction. Like I fundamentally disagree with this immigration issue. We need to fundamentally change to have it go in another direction. It's much more like, oh well, the two choices are like this or this party, and this guy said something that's harsher. This party's a bit harsher on illegal immigration this election, so I'll switch to them. It's very difficult to get, especially the kind of older voters you meet, to change their view like that. So that's why still, the number one thing for us, as far as I'm concerned, is like the young people and the young guys, especially that are increasingly being radicalized by, TikTok and Instagram and X. And I really think, our best hope is just that we totally get that generation on board. Obviously, they're majority leftist politically, Gen Z, but the portion that are right wing are totally abandoning establishment conservatism, embracing nationalism, and even the ones that identify as conservatives increasingly just use nationalist talking points and have a nationalist worldview. So I still think that the number one thing, some people got very harsh on this idea of like meta-political change or cultural change, or they say things like online doesn't matter, you just have to go into the real world. And it's like, well, in the real world, people are actually pretty left wing. People are actually pretty liberal, and they actually like decide most of their decisions politically based on like the last news report they watched. So there has to be a really fundamental change that is going to be done in the online space, which is basically just we just need to radicalize like young people as much as possible for the next couple of decades, and that's the only thing I really see that's going to change things fundamentally.
Right. Of course, you're going up against other media that is trying to convert them in the other direction. And a lot of those left-wing sites are very active. Like the Reddit campaign against us was very active. Um,
Mm,
Here it feels like the reverse though. It feels like real life is more conservative than the internet because I've been looking at
yeah.
local responses. Well, I'm in Arkansas, so maybe that's part of it. But I've been looking at local responses to the news articles about us, like on Facebook, the majority of local people weighing in are negative. They say it makes our area look bad, etc. But then the overwhelming majority of people I talk to in person don't feel that way. It could be a bias where, the people who are willing to even talk to me already are kind of on my side. That's possible. But yeah, I don't know. On that note, like the real life aspect that maybe you could gain an edge, what I'm trying to do with door knocking is a little bit novel. I haven't tried it yet, but it's on my agenda now to go out and not only organize RTTL land buys for communities and such, but also in those same areas to go and door knock for political rallies on demographic change. Just a very basic single issue. Hey, are you concerned about this? What is your town going to look like for your kids and grandkids at current rates? I think it's a simple enough concept that can be explained to just about anyone. Maybe I'll encounter a lot of pushback, but the interesting thing about that approach is that when they come to the political rally, there'll be solutions offered that are actionable. It's like, okay, instead of just vote for this candidate, it'll be like, so, hey, are you concerned? Here are the things you can do. You can work towards one of these communities being founded through RTTL, or you can join Patriot Front or some other activist network that could be used to mobilize voting blocks in key elections because they have such good ground game and they themselves organize door knocking and things like that really effectively. So, just like, is there a way of door knocking and recruiting not just votes, but recruiting people into another kind of lifestyle or other commitments? I know it's a lot to ask all at once, that which is why I'm trying to go about it through rallies, because I believe in this spirit thing. I believe there's when you get groups together, they will change their mind on issues that they would not change their mind on individually. I worked for a Chinese ballet company that was also a cult for a while, and the Westerners they hired, a lot of them, it was surprising. They, after enough like time spent in this Chinese cult, they would eventually just become true believers in it. Um, People you would, if you met in any other aspect of life or area of life, they would seem like perfectly normal people. And I think there's a real latent potential if you get people in physical spaces where there is an opportunity for a shared spirit, you can really dramatically change minds. That is also something I think happened in Nazi Germany. So I don't know. What do you think about that? Other ways of recruiting on the ground for more than just voting, and what's actually possible in Ireland?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's one of the reasons nationalist groups have moved to this model of active clubs and providing a sense of community to young people that join, giving them activities, fitness, MMA, retreats, these kinds of things. Yeah, it is important to offer people a social circle like that. And sometimes that can provide other, opportunities, employment opportunities, things to fall back on if they suffer in their life due to their politics. Um, so that is something that really targets young people, especially. In terms of older people, in terms of like more normie type people, it's difficult to see exactly what you offer there. I mean, for you, like the intentional community thing is definitely something. For political parties that are trying to engage power, it's sort of like you're going to have a core of activists that really care about this stuff and will get involved and, do all sorts of things together and take initiative. And then, you're going to have a mass of people who, unfortunately, yeah, it is like kind of like what can you do with people that are just sympathetic and will say they agree with you and everything, but just aren't naturally very political or radical and just kind of want to go about their day? Maybe they'll lend you a vote, maybe they won't bother voting. Um, it's a tricky one because, at the same time, you don't want to encourage. I don't want to encourage like nationalist parties or nationalist groups in Europe to like, put all your focus into intentional communities and drop mass politics or drop focusing on the political system or like tactically targeted political campaigns. So it's I don't know, it's difficult, and it's definitely what you're saying is true. It's definitely an avenue we should be exploring more in terms of what can we actually offer people to get them to have some kind of skin in the game or take some kind of interest rather than just like propositionally you agree with us more than the alternative, and you can land us one vote out of the millions of other people that are going to vote, or just become a social media follower or something. So it's, yeah, to translate it into something real and into real world power is obviously the tricky thing right now.
what is the like the social scene as far as voluntary associations like in Ireland? In the US, 100 years ago, 50% or more of male adults were in some kind of club or organization outside of work, just in their spare time. So what is it like in Ireland? How connected are people? Is there the same kind of alienation and individualism that exists here, or what's the scene like?
Increasingly so, probably not to the same extent. There is, especially in rural Ireland, I think there is a stronger sense of community than you would find in other places. The GAA, the Gaelic Athletic Association, was actually a big part of that. It's interesting. It was founded by nationalists, actually. One of them I have writings by him in the collection of Irish nationalist writings I believe are released. But this was kind of their thinking. It's like we have these native sports. We want to encourage a national sense in people. We want to encourage a sense of cultural Irishness. And so they got together. They codified the rules of these games, hurling and Gaelic football, and then they created a centralized organization, and then they created local groups, local clubs, and then they would have inter-county games and like a all Ireland competition between the counties, and they became the most popular sports in Ireland, and that actually did like revive a sense of Irishness distinct from Britain, and was even like a source of organization during the War of Independence and so on. If you see some people might have watched the Wind That Shakes the Barley. It's a good movie with Cillian Murphy about the War of Independence and the Civil War. But you see, like they're kind of organizing around their hurling club at the beginning of that. But that's something like even when I was growing up, like the center was still like the kind of parish community where there's like there's a church, there's like the local pub, there's the local GAA club, and everyone kind of plays at that club. Maybe they socialize at the pub after they go to the same church. So those kinds of bonds were very strong in Ireland, and still are in a lot of places. And people have these kinds of locus of identities where you have your parish, you have like your local club area, then you have your own county, and that's represented, and then the country at large, and those things kind of feed into each other. People that take an interest in their more local communities, it kind of scales up, and it comes with a sense of national pride. So that is stronger in Ireland, but certainly has been dissipating very quickly. There's been a huge when I've grown up, there's a huge problem of like male suicides, and that's still a problem. But I remember, like, even in my area of rural Ireland was like a black spot in Europe for male suicides. And it is that phenomenon of going from a very embedded, uh, homogeneous community where things are kind of taken for granted to not even the immigration thing, but just the fact that suddenly, for work, people move to cities, the values change very fast. People are insulated more. They're huddling more in their own houses and rooms, and there isn't that same sense of community and leisure coming through these communal activities. And I think that was kind of devastating on men's mental health and alienation and sense of well-being. And it is something that still exists, but unfortunately, like everything is in decline. We had like there's like an All Ireland hurling final where like the counties compete, and then there's the final in Croke Park in Dublin. And again, it's so connected to like the history of nationalism, because Croke Park, which is like the main stadium, became this kind of hallowed ground because during the War of Independence, there was an event, Bloody Sunday, where the British massacred players that were playing on the field as revenge for the IRA targeted British spies. So, but people were talking about this a lot, that like all the stewards at the games the last day were like all Indians and black people, because the GA had just like outsourced the volunteering to immigrants. People can get visas from outside the EU if they come to Ireland to volunteer. It's like insane immigration laws. So yeah, like everything, that is being transformed. You'll have mainstream media here blasting out the fantastic stories of the Nigerian who's the best Gaelic football player at his local team. So those things have declined rapidly, and part of it just is changes in the economy, globalization, the way Ireland's economy has developed, where to find kind of gainful employment, if you're a professional now, if you're qualified, you sort of have to move to the cities. And it kind of strips the human capital from these local areas. And now Ireland is following the same process as everywhere else in the West, in terms of decline in birth rates, liberalism, individualism, all the typical problems that come with it. But it was something that for a long time held off a lot of the other problems that Western Europe would have faced.
Would it be legal to have an ethnic Irish only Gaelic football league?
Um, I'm not sure exactly what the law is around that. There's very strict employment law in terms of you can't refuse someone a job for their racial status, and I think that extends to housing as well. But I don't think it's anything on the level of civil rights law where it is for you basically it's like your main constitution now. It just informs everything. I think that probably could be done, or even if you were to, I've seen it proposed. I think it would be very doable for people to create like Gaelic intentional communities where people, where it's Irish speakers, and maybe they're located out in the west of Ireland and in a rural area. I think the law is probably more lenient here on that than you would find in a lot of other places. Again, just because multiracialism, the open society, it's still a bit more new here. We haven't had that like legal assault on all of these other avenues. So I think that's probably possible. The thing is, I mean,
Yeah,
the
I
the,
think
the teams themselves are probably still. It is still like 90-95% Irish. I mean, even if you look at like the club teams on the national level, I mean, you don't really see any black or brown people yet. So I guess there wouldn't be that strong pull factor yet of like, you're losing this, go create your own one, because people just aren't really observing that yet. Obviously we have a massive immigrants, um, more focused in the cities and probably less likely to be interested in those kinds of things. So kind of refreshingly, it's still this nice little preserve of Irishness. It's, especially as I get older, I kind of appreciate those things like the annual kind of like inter-county rivalries, where you get this very much something that's of the old Ireland that hasn't been transformed yet and can't really be transformed by its nature until you get the demographic change.
yeah, obviously I believe in pushing up to what is lawful as far as asserting our own identity and independence. Um, So I wonder what the consequence would be of maybe not at the higher end level because there isn't that
Hmm.
draw, as you say, but maybe at the level of like youth leagues. I'm sure the
Hmm.
younger generation is less Irish than the older generation, and so there'd be more of an impetus, and parents are inclined to worry about the safety of their children and are
Hmm.
often conscious of crime rate differences and stuff, even implicitly if they haven't like looked it up explicitly. So what do you think the consequence would be if the National Party or somebody sponsored a youth Gaelic football league open only to Irish people?
Well, I wouldn't like to speak too confidently because there could well be some kind of equality law I'm not familiar with that applies to like voluntary organizations or something. But I would imagine with the current state of law, that would probably be pretty doable. And then it's just a question of, if you can get the right amount of numbers, because obviously you'd need people represented from different areas of the country and so on. So yeah, I mean that's an interesting idea, especially like I said, it hasn't really hit people yet. You don't really it's one area where you wouldn't notice the demographic change as much. It's still kind of a preserve of old Ireland. But in the future, as that begins to change rapidly, that would definitely be an interesting idea, especially because it would kind of rekindle, reawaken the reason that organization was established in the first place and the thinking behind it. It's that's why I included the essay by Michael Cusack, the guy that established GA, where he's talking about these are like martial sports, and that's why they're so good. Is like they're rooted in our own history, our own blood, and this is like a way to create a martial race. This is why these games were practiced. It's the ultimate game of like physicality and strength, and that this was to basically rekindle a sense of Irishness and sort of martial pride in Irish men. and create something that was very distinct from Britain, from other parts of Europe. So, it's interesting. There's always that is there to tap into again, right?
Yeah, definitely. The last thing I guess I'd like to hit, unless there's something else you want to talk about before we wrap up, and we should talk again sometime relatively soon more on philosophy and maybe even a fifth episode of understanding Platonism. I would like that. But the last thing I want to hit is I want to get your take on my basic strategy with how to handle the pushback on RTTL and like what my ultimate goals are with that. So obviously, the communities are the goal in itself. I think that the goal of nationalist politics in general or identitarian politics is to maintain communities of our people and just preserve our people. So, we have the ability to do that with the legal apparatus here, although it could easily be taken away. Right now, we believe what we're doing is lawful, but we've kind of pushed it as far as reasonably we could push it, being safe, and that's going to create a situation where precedent may be set, we may be sued, we may push that needle a little bit in one direction or another. And now I'm, thinking in terms of if they are trying to take away our right to be our own group, to exist independently, and we don't assert that right in a corresponding way, then it's it's sort of like in a relationship, if someone tolerates abuse, gradually a master slave dynamic just evolves. If you put up with being mistreated and you don't assert yourself back, then that dynamic will be allowed to stay. And I think we've done that. We've allowed ourselves to be suppressed and have our freedoms taken away. And out of fear of being sued or things going wrong, we've kind of done the minimal amount in our personal lives in the other direction. So maybe we, ideologically end up being strong nationalists or even fascists or something like that. But then when it comes to how we're actually living our lives, we live in the system, abide by the system's rules, don't really create our own things. So I think creating our own things as ethnicities, as racial identities in the case of white Americans, which I think is a true ethnicity and should be considered that. The Afrikaner are a true ethnicity. Maybe they're like
Mhm.
more homogeneous than we are. Uh, Probably that is the case, but still, I think ethnic identity is more than genes. It's also this shared history and culture, ethno-linguistic or ethnocultural identities are somewhat flexible. I don't want to take that too far, obviously, but I think Americans can count. But uh, in any case, but I think that's very important that we go ahead and stake out those territories for ourselves, whether it's a youth football or Gaelic football or whatever it is league. I don't even know what the sport looks like. I'm kind of curious. What is it like? Rugby? Like, what does it physically look like to play the game?
Yeah, it's like a soccer ball, but you carry it. It's a bit more physical in terms of tackles and so on. Hurling's a very interesting sport. It is like a super martial sport, as in you have your hurling stick, and it's the fastest field game in the world. Again, it's very physical. Um, it's very much like a kind of warrior training sport, as how it was conceived. You should check that out. It's actually a great sport to watch.
Yeah, I'll look it up on YouTube. So, whether it's that or intentional communities or recreational lands, I think you got to push all the way up until basically you are
Mhm.
denied. The system will just say no at a certain point, and you have to ratchet it up until that point. And then where you meet that point, be conscious of public sentiment. And you're constrained by the law, but you're also constrained by public sentiment. And in a way, public sentiment is more powerful if it's mobilized intelligently, especially in a political season, especially in an era of a sea change like the US is likely to experience in the near future. Like, there's no obvious ascendant force on the left, there's no obvious ascendant force on the right. There's going to be a lot of jostling in the near future. And so public opinion becomes more relevant in that kind of age. Um, And so that's the situation. So I think it's important to push up being conscious of how people feel about it. I think the community thing is pretty safe. You know, we're simply asserting our right to exist on our own. We're not marching down the street, and we're not occupying conspicuous public spaces like owning businesses. The you know cake baking thing with the uh, homosexual marriage, and the baker didn't want to do it. Like, people, even then, people were on the baker's side largely, and I think the baker actually won that case. But I think what we're doing is even safer, and I think a larger number of people would respect our right to do it, because there are so many just really simple, obvious arguments that you can make. We're occupying 150 acres. Like, plenty of people own more land than that, and they don't let anyone on. So we can't be depriving people of real estate. Like, I, as an individual, might have bought more land conceivably, and I wouldn't let anyone, I certainly wouldn't let, ethnic groups that I didn't get along with on, just like you wouldn't let people that you wouldn't get along with onto your land. Um, so anyway, that and other very natural, easy arguments. So what's your take? I know you've seen the Sky News thing, which is a hit piece, and then you've seen probably some other stuff that I've posted. So what's your read on the situation? What do you think about that strategy, ratcheting up to tilt that needle, and especially at a time when we might, through influence of public opinion on these matters, get some kind of political change out of it?
Yeah, I like it. I would encourage people to watch the Sky News piece. Actually, it's one of the few examples where, yeah, they try and do a hit piece and they make the subject look a lot better than themselves. And it's like there was the tactic during the kind of heyday of the alt right of like going for the media spectacle, and you invite in Vice or you invite in CNN or something, and they do the piece, and sometimes it brought the ideas to new people, whatever. But oftentimes it was kind of counterproductive in that it's like, okay, they profile people, and it's like Richard Spencer is there with a glass of brandy talking about how we should like colonize Constantinople, and how he's going to build a giant phallic statue in Washington, and like annex Haiti and all this kind of stuff. And it's just this like weird disconnect of like these powerless people that are kind of playing up to all the stereotypes, and the media can easily do this framing of like these hateful oppressive people are out there. But in your case, it was funny, they tried to apply the framing that would have fit that kind of piece. But then it's like, yeah, like you said, there's talking to these people that he travels out far into a rural area, and it's like people that are just like living, having children, engaged in pretty wholesome activities. And it's just this like British journalist standing there like, well, I think that's wrong because it's racist. And it's like, well, who is it harming? And he's like, well, it's just racist. It's like, so the framing totally fell flat. And if you look at the comments, yeah, it's like lots of them are like, well, I'm black and I like my multiracial suburb, but what's the problem if these people want to live like that? It's like lots of comments like that. I didn't really see any comment that was pro the Sky News perspective. And then even, I don't know if you heard afterwards, they had like a radio piece to promote it, and they brought on this Jewish like anti-extremism researcher, and she was just awful to listen to. She was like, because the interviewer kind of put the perspective to her of like, well, what about, they say they're just living together, they're not harming anyone. And she's like, no, that's disgusting. These people are white supremacists, that basically Arkansas needs to immediately like change the law to get rid of all these people. It just sounded like totally deranged and hateful. Like, I can't imagine any kind of neutral person listening to that and like siding with her and being like, this is like the spokesman for the powerless people against the oppressors here. It's like clearly flips the dynamic. But I do think there's a lot of ground to be made up in terms of opposition to civil rights law in the US. I did write something after the Shiloh Hendricks thing about like the Fair Housing Act and civil rights law, where it's like I was surprised how much the conservative movement kind of got behind the Shiloh Hendricks thing. Matt Walsh, very much so. He did a couple of videos supporting that. And you see increasingly like more mainstream kind of conservative voices like, we shouldn't have to live like this. White people shouldn't have to put up with this. White people should be allowed to, self-segregate if they want, this kind of thing. Um, but the thing is, they have a totally contradictory position, a lot of these people, because most of them, all of them pretty much support civil rights law and support things like the Fair Housing Act, and, would denounce someone that questioned that or that challenged that. But then, outwardly they're saying, well, I support full freedom of association. Maybe they'll identify as libertarian, and they'll claim to support values that are totally at odds with what civil rights law does. So there's clearly space there in terms of like there's a misalignment between what they believe and what they say and what they're actually supporting. And sometimes maybe it's just like they haven't even questioned it, they haven't even looked into the consequences of this kinds of thing. Christopher Caldwell released that book about civil rights law a few years ago that was quite influential among intellectual conservatives, and Hanania became critical of it. He released a book that was somewhat influential. But in terms of like the average conservative or even like the bigger influencers, I think there's definitely ground there to move them from, okay, you're against anti-white discrimination, Matt Walsh. Okay, you're against the mobs being said on people like Charlotte Hendricks. Okay, you say things like, if white racists want to go and form their own communities, who cares? Not my problem. Um, why don't you be consistent and actually say, okay, civil rights law, all this kind of thing. I'm against DEI. This is like the greatest form of DEI, right? Where you even have like quotas in housing where you have to create a certain amount of DEI and housing is allocated. This is like DEI on steroids. So I think there's grounds there in terms of like everyone needs to move to that position of just opposing that, even if politically it's probably not feasible to roll back civil rights, right? But at least politically, like on principle, to be against that. And then that should become a kind of filter, a kind of test, as some other things have become, like in the conservative movement, like you have to be against anti-white hate now. You have to somewhat be against replacement migration, or at least like signal in that direction. I think the same kind of thing could happen where it's like, if Ben Shapiro or James Lindsay or some of these people are defending civil rights law, it's like, you can kind of get that in people's heads of like, that you're supporting DEI, you're supporting forced integration, you're supporting forced diversity. Like these are all values that conservatives hold that they're against. So you can kind of just force the consistency on that. So I think it's good, like you said, to kind of take a stand on the most defensible position, and then suddenly the media is putting out pieces telling people that the white supremacists and racists aren't like the people that are plotting to take over the government and kill people or something. It's like this guy out with a chicken farm, like minding his own business. It's like a totally indefensible framing, and you see that in the response to it. So I think it aligns nicely with the anti-woke movement and just the general direction of where things are going, of how they feel about these things. Like I said, where more mainstream conservatives are going in terms of becoming more skeptical of, the older forms of statism and leftism and DEI that have been implemented that couldn't be questioned before, things like civil rights law and, Martin Luther King as this great hero. So I feel like, all the pieces are kind of aligning to push in that direction. I saw you reposted something earlier that some lawmaker in the US was giving a speech saying we need to roll back civil rights law. So I definitely think that's something that, if you talk about moving the Overton window in terms of getting that, conservative portion of the country to totally flip how they view that, which is really fundamental to the whole project of forced diversity and anti-whiteism. And that just seems like, yeah, that seems like a very achievable goal. And like, politically, is it going to be achievable that civil rights law will actually be rolled back? Maybe not. But at the same time, Trump got into office and he took a policy proposal that originated with Richard Hanania about using an executive order to get rid of civil rights-based DEI hiring in federal employment, and that changed things quite dramatically. So, once you're pushing in that direction, you'll be able to find legislative things that can be changed. Maybe local regions and states will challenge elements of it. Maybe that will force a greater conversation if that comes up against federal government and so on. But gradually, by using a principle that everyone agrees with, like freedom of association, everyone on the conservative side agrees with, like anti-DEI, anti-forced diversity, that's suddenly, the case for nationalism or forming ethnically homogeneous communities is actually bound up with that case. And then it becomes a lot easier to make your case to people that hold those values as well, even if, okay, maybe they don't want to join your community. Maybe they're not going to like call themselves a white nationalist or something, but they can at least support on principle that these people have a right to organize and should create a legal structure that's more favorable to those people. So I think there's big ground in that. And with the direction of mainstream politics right now, it's like Trump is going to exit the stage. Who's going to come from the Republican Party that's going to be like some great populist firebrand that's going to change things dramatically? It's kind of hard to imagine. And to have something real that you can push for that's actually achievable rather than it's like the guy that went on Jubilee and he's like, I want like a fascist, like Catholic autocracy. And it's like, okay, well, there's like a few thousand people in the country that agree with you on that, and probably most of them follow you on Twitter. It's like, what are you going to do with that? You're kind of just putting yourself out there in this position of like, I'm the guy that has the most extreme view that you're fighting against. Maybe you'll get some more people to agree with you, but it doesn't impact anything. So I think having an achievable goal like that intersects with the broader conservative movement where there is real reach and influence and things trickle down very fast from these larger influencers like Walsh and Charlie Kirk, and being able to tie the nationalist case to something that's very defensible in the majority of people's minds like that. um yeah, I think there's huge potential in that. So yeah, people should watch the Sky News piece. I think it's a great example of what you're going for with the project.
Totally. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Um, which is why I'm approaching things the way I am. And I didn't premeditate all of it, but and I was also pushed into this course of action by a larger community that I think there's something to that where we think together in ways that are deeper and more powerful than we can possibly think of as individuals. But which is why also, I appreciate talking to you and getting your feedback and input. I gave you some unsolicited advice on the Irish situation, or just, suggestions, thoughts. So I'm going to solicit some very direct advice. What do you think are good next steps for someone in my position to pursue the kind of, uh, agenda that you just outlined?
Well, I did, watching the doc, it seems like a very wholesome, interesting community. I think it probably wasn't at all what people were expecting in terms of you even gave them like a music performance at the end and you were playing them the clarinet. I think people would be very curious watching that. I always thought you should create some kind of YouTube channel to follow the progress of it. Because there is this other subculture of people that go off grid, go live in a forest alone, or someone that like builds a tiny house, or quits their job and like gets a caravan and lives out of it. And some of those channels have like millions of subscribers. People are very interested in that. It's a large subculture. I think you could have a very interesting story if if people were willing to, if you put your story out there of how things are progressing. And then, there is that kind of parasocial thing of people can follow your guys' daily vlogs or whatever and actually see this community being built. I think that would be really interesting to people. Even the guy mentioned there was like 3 women he interviewed that all met their partners there. I mean, that's like a fascinating thing, like sociologically, even if you were to document that, like new members coming in and then, they're starting families and so on. So I think you should try and create some kind of, maybe not daily or weekly, some kind of update video blog. Could probably survive on YouTube, but on other platforms. And I think you might find a lot of people even outside nationalism that are just very curious to watch this community grow now that it's got this mainstream attention.
That's definitely in the cards. We're planning a RTTL podcast, actually in this same studio that I'm putting together. I've just put up paneling in the last few days and I insulated it and we'll put in some couches and get together weekly, talk about, developments, include recordings of construction and stuff like that. That was the biggest unintentional advertisement to include the fact that 3 women found their partners here. I feel like they were secretly on our side or something. Tom Cheshire,
Yeah.
the reporter, he got along with me very, very well. I don't know if you remember, but when he interviewed me at the very beginning of it, I was like, I'm feeling a little nervous about this interview now. because he had just flipped a switch where he was very friendly with me. We talked about Plato, it was great. And then at that interview spot, he just like became hyper aggressive, asking very targeted,
Mm.
directed questions, loaded questions. So I don't know. I mean, maybe he just, I'm not sure what the true motives are of some of these people. I feel like it's also they're covering this because secretly, like deep down, they want it. They're attracted to the idea of communities like this. Because why wouldn't they be? Like instinctively, people should want to live among their own kind peacefully in a rural area. It's sort of like, you know, evolutionary fantasy, an ideal. Um, Now,
Well, I won't give
the
you too much
reality is
advice,
not
but
quite
I think
as, yeah,
I think even the podcast thing might be too structured in terms of like if you look at some of those channels of guys that just like upload their daily life living off grid or something. I mean, if you just had a camera and go around and just kind of you know, if people are willing to be on camera, but you know, you let people get somewhat familiar with the people living there and follow their stories, and just follow like the construction work being done and just have it be kind of an active thing showing what's going on in the community and people get familiar with it. It's like people watch Fish Tank, people used to watch Big Brother, people like to you know, parasocially follow humans put into the same container. I think, and with all of the kind of nuances of what's happening with your community, it's such an interesting thing. I think you could get a large following if you presented that.
so turn it into a reality TV show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
mean, think of the drama you have already. It's like you introduce three new characters and they all like, you know, get married to other people in the community within like while the blog series is ongoing. It would be fascinating. Maybe
Yeah.
this
We
seems like
cannot.
almost too voyeuristic, though. I'm like, all you people need to like put yourselves on camera so I can like follow your lives. I mean, it's I kind of feel bad suggesting it, but you know, just the ones that are willing to do it, right? It could be interesting.
Uh-huh. Individual results may vary when it comes to moving down here. Not everyone will find a bride, but you know, we
Well,
are working
you can
toward
just
that.
edit it and you know pinch your community in the best possible light.
Yes. I'll probably still do the podcast just as a framing device, a narrative tool,
Hmm.
and then have the clips be, you know, the real focus. But it's also a lot easier to, you know, just get around and talk rather than all of the kind of intensive editing that goes in and, you know, taking the time out of your day to go and get enough footage
Hmm.
together and compelling footage. The What is Return to the Land video I made, I kind of did that. You know, I did a lot of interviews, but people who haven't done content, it's it's a little bit uncomfortable for them and they have to kind of learn how to do it. Now we would get used to it and everyone who's been here, people in the first community kind of understand that we're at the center of all of this attention and they're obviously
Hmm.
okay with it. They're living here. Future communities are going to be a lot more private. So yeah, we might as well just go full reality TV. Good advice, Keith. I appreciate it. Is there anything else that you wanted to add? And also, of course, you know, where can people find your work, buy your books, subscribe?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. You can find my books if you search me on Amazon. KeithWoods.pub is my Substack. That's like my main hub for content. I publish everything there, so you can go follow my newsletter there. Don't think I have anything else to add. This was a good discussion. We should definitely do it again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, good luck in Europe. I have a lot of optimism for all of us across the board. I feel like this is an important time. Um, I feel like the establishment is just crumbling. You know, their reputation is going down very quickly. We have more tools than ever to tell our side of the story more compellingly. So I think big things